So welcome to Politics and Prose Bookstore. I'm Adam Waterous. Dale Maharidge is a journalist and teacher and author of many books, including And Their Children After Them, which was awarded the Pulitzer Prize in nonfiction. We are here tonight, however, for his new book, Bringing Mulligan Home, which is the story of the Good War before it was called the Good War. Dale's book is part memoir and part open account of what the soldiers in his father's company went through during the battles of Guam and Okinawa. Maharidge explores a side of the war that has resisted examination. Bringing Mulligan Home reveals the scars all soldiers bear in compassionate and illuminating prose. Thank you all for being here, and if you will please join me in welcoming Dale Maharidge.
That's all right. I have to confess, this is the first time I'm talking about this book. I worked on it for 12 years, and here I'm at Politics and Prose, and this is the inaugural talk. So for good, bad, or ugly, I got to warn you. It's also, it's hard for me to talk about this. I kind of was thinking about coming here tonight. This is my 10th book. I've done a lot of talks. This is probably the hardest talk I'll ever give. This is about my dad. And it's called a memoir, but I never called it a memoir when I was working on it. It was more of it's deeply reported, but it's a very personal, deeply reported story. So just with that as an announcement, I grew up with this picture in my life ever since I can remember. My dad had a tool grinding business in his basement. He went to a factory and ground steel. He was a steel worker all day long. He'd come home at 4:30, eat dinner, nap at 5:20. That was religion. Down in the basement, grinding steel in our basement. The lights would dim from the power being drawn from these huge machines. And this picture was on a gas meter. So at age 6 and 7, I would see it and wonder, who are these guys? Eventually, before the age of 10, my father said it was taken on Guadalcanal. That's all he said. And this is my dad grinding. I took this picture later in 1983, but this is pretty much what he did at that same period of time. And my dad had a lot of anger issues. This is not unusual look for him. He hated that work. And I started working with him when I was like 12 or 13. But I used to hang out down there at 8, 9, 10. And one time he talked about the picture, only once when he was on meds after a drunk driver hit him. And he said, they blame me, but it wasn't my fault. I didn't kill him. And he got emotional. My dad never got emotional. Some of you in this room know my dad. You know, he was the prototype of a Marine. And I just, as a kid, I knew never ask questions about this photograph or the war. When he would talk, I would listen. And then I would just listen rapidly. And there was one night we were grinding. I was grinding steel on a machine called Covell next to his machine. And here's this picture that is behind. My dad's here. And he just started going off into a riff about the night on Guam when he was shooting Japanese soldiers and stacking the dead bodies around him to protect them from the shrapnel and bullets. And he said the Marines were screaming for their mothers. And he screamed, "Shut up. You don't have no mother. Shut up." But there was the and another word between those words. Not a nice word. Use your imagination. I'm making it G-rated for the film. Just screaming as if, and I realized at 12 years old, it's like he was back in that night. It was a total relapse into what was happening. And as anger came out, we would be kids at the table. There was my brother, my sister, and I. And we're kids. We'd spill something. He would blow up and just start screaming. Or if we were out fishing and something would go wrong, boom, he would blow up. It's explosive temper. Then he would turn around and be the best guy on earth. He was a great dad other times. When you write a book like this, it's hard. I don't want to paint my father as some mean, evil man. He wasn't. He was a great dad. I still love him. Love him dearly. I understand him more now since doing this book. But he was a complex man. And early on, I knew somehow it was connected to the war. I just had to be. So he dies in 2000. This is Michael Williamson's photo. He's in the room here tonight. And then actually, one of the subjects, Mary, standing next to me, is in the photo as well here. I started a quest to learn about his war. Before I go into that, I'll give you some backstory about his family. This is my grandmother. They were Russian immigrants. They were ethnic Russians from Ukraine who came here before the turn of the century. And she was like a peasant woman. She never learned how to speak English. My grandfather, his father, worked on the B&O Railroad. Very quiet guy. They lived in Cleveland. This is the south side of Cleveland. If you've seen the movie The Deer Hunter, you'll know what that is. That's where the wedding scene happened. I finally watched, before my mother died, I watched The Deer Hunter with my mom. She was almost in tears. It was more like a documentary, that wedding scene, and that she says, wow, we grew up scuzzy. I mean, Michael Cimino, the director, really captured it. But my grandfather's cousin was one of the 7 founders of that church. This is taken from the front yard by my dad, looking towards the church. So that's where he came from when he went into the war. 8 kids in a 2-bedroom house. Another picture my dad took. My dad actually could have had a life as a photographer. I mean, he had an eye, you know? Rules of thirds, everything's in there. Just impoverished, rough, tough neighborhood. So he goes to boot camp, and this is him right after boot camp before he got sent overseas. And this is him on Guadalcanal. It was a staging area. This is after the Battle of Guam, after he was hit by a shrapnel from a Japanese mortar and almost killed. It's the most vulnerable picture of my dad. And if you look close at his eyes, he's scared. This is him after the war. He was drunk for 4 years. They documented everything back then. I don't know why. He ran a numbers racket. He was involved in one. He told me all the stuff we were grinding steel. It all came out. I just listened. He had a real rough re-entry. And then he met my mom. Now, she's my mom, so I can't have an opinion, but people tell me she was an attractive woman. He fell for her head over heels. They ended up courting, marrying, and my mom said for the first year, she never saw his temper or his rage. He was like perfect. Then it started coming out. But he's a loving, wonderful guy. He's just typical, we all do this kind of picture today in the retro little booths. They weren't retro then, of course. But then there was this dark, brooding creature. My mother took this picture. He would have these, and again, you know, my mother just thought he was crazy. She never, ever talked about it being related to the war. Then we came along. And yes, I am this old. That's what cars looked like when I was a kid. Let's move on from that. We grew up in the suburbs. My father built the house with my uncle and a few other people. That's my mom and me and my sister in the side yard. Typical post-war, you know, mom stays at home, dad works in the factory, but behind the facade was a lot of turmoil. I was a happy kid when I was a kid, small. By the time 8, 7, 8, 9, 10, I became brooding. The rages, it infected our house. My father's would blow up, and my mother would fight back. We'd all run hiding. When I got old enough, I ran out into the woods. I absorbed his anger. Yet again, as I say, we would go fishing in Canada, and he was this great guy. So this Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde dad, about the age of 10 or so, maybe 8, 9, I forget. I was still pretty small. My mother boosted me up into our attic. There was a little crawl space, like a square. She pushed me up in there. She would push the boxes up there all year for Christmas. So I'd throw the boxes down to her. My job is she could push me up there. There was a chest, and I opened it up, and there was all these things from the war. And I was fascinated, but I really couldn't linger. A couple years later, when I was old enough and the coast was clear, I was up there looking at the Japanese passport. This is the guy in the passport, and I wondered, how did my dad kill this guy? Training manual. There was a name in it. I thought it looked like a name. I mean, I didn't know, but it looked like a name. Was it a name? I don't know. Then it was this, and as a 12-year-old boy, especially fascinating, but let's not go there. So fast forward, I just want to give you some backstory. My parents retired to California, to Sacramento. My dad had probably the happiest 15 years of his life. His rages subsided. He would count the citrus coming off of each tree. Some people in the room know that. And I found some of those logs. I still have them. 400 grapefruit came off that tree, Emily, one year. He would watch the ants all day long. It was very simple, and he kind of was losing his mind, but he seemed happy. And then, of course, he passed away, and we buried him across the river here at Arlington. And I had this point started doing some digging into what happened. But I buried a copy of the picture with my dad at Arlington when he got his 21 shots. This is, again, Michael Williamson. Thank you for these photographs. This is the flag being given to my mom, and my brother's sitting next to him, to her, and with the guy there. So then I started my quest. 2 days after he died, he had a Japanese silk flag in his drawer, and it had 22 names on it. So I just started calling. Well, and also I found there were these pictures of the guy. There's his name, Herman Mulligan. I thought, Dad gave me a clue. Well, if he was really giving me a clue, he would have written what happened on the photographs. But at least I had names. So he's Herman Mulligan from South Carolina. I got George Popovich, talked to him, learned some things about Mulligan. Ed Hoffman, who I just talked to a few months ago, his daughter just emailed me yesterday. A lot of these guys are still around. And I learned that Mulligan threw a grenade into a burial tomb on Okinawa, and it blew up. It was filled with munitions. But no one knows what happened to him. But I had to go deeper. I got the muster rolls from Ed Hoffman, 400 names. And I went through each one, color-coded. Hundreds and hundreds of phone calls. Here's a better, closer picture of it. Dead, probably dead, common names. You cannot imagine how many Robert Harrisons I called. I needed Robert Harrison, and he was in Texas. I called hundreds of dead ends. Couldn't find these guys. Even people with complex names vanished. Many died between 1945 and 1950. When I called and learned, they drank themselves to death. The trauma of the war just really tore on these guys. So I started finding people, more and more people. I eventually found 29. This is a depiction of the burial tombs on Okinawa. Okinawa custom is to bury the dead in tombs and then worship the dead, their ancestry worship. And the tomb on the left is the kind of tomb that Mulligan threw the grenade into. My dad was squad leader that day. I sent away a Freedom of Information Act for his death record, and it shows body not recovered, blast concussion atmosphere. That's the tomb blowing up, but body not recovered? And everyone said, no, he wasn't buried in the rubble. And my dad said, I up. But they made me sergeant anyway. And I theorize that my father was squad leader, ordered Mulligan to throw the grenade. My dad was a BAR man, fully automatic machine gun, was covering him, or the piece of roof, 3 feet of the tomb roof, came down on Mulligan. Guys told me that it was like a volcano. It went up a half mile. Guys were a quarter mile away. The rocks were coming down around them. One line, right on Mulligan, found out he was a hemophiliac from one of the guys in the company. He lied about when he went in. He was going to die. So my dad probably was doing blood, trying to stop the blood. The dog tags may have come off, or he ordered him. That's why he felt guilty. None of the guys blamed my dad. Several guys said, nobody, I never heard his name. I think my dad just felt guilty. So I learned that, but I realized, but that's not the purpose of this story or the book. And I spent hundreds and hundreds of phone calls. Went to South Carolina twice, trying to find Mulligan's kin. He was half Jewish, half Irish. Small town, everyone was dead and gone. I couldn't find anything about him. It was a bigger story. It's about the war. These guys, I realized, were talking for the first time. They were hitting their late 70s when I started, mid-late 70s. Now they're in their 80s and 90s, the ones who were left. Near the end, something triggered, and they started yabbing about the war. One guy I called, Mr. Rossblock in New Jersey, I called because he was shown taken out of the unit on June 1st, right after the tomb blew up, 1945. And I said, is this Mr. Rossblock who was on Okinawa during World War II? What do you want him for? Well, you see, this tomb blew up. I went through this whole explanation, and it was silence. And I thought he hung up. And it was a hoarse whisper. I was there. So he started talking, but it was like I was touch and go, and I didn't want to cause trauma. So I said, well, Mr. Rossblock, can I send you a picture? And maybe you'll... He said, I don't remember anything. I went out of my mind. I was in the hospital for months after that. So send a picture. So I sent a picture. 2 weeks later, I call back, motor mouth for an hour about the details. And at the end, he said, you're the first person I've ever talked to about this, ever. And we became phone friends for over years. Talked for 2 hours at a time. He was 80. He's 80. Mr. Rossblock is now 88. We email. He emails. I'm up late. He's up late. 2 in the morning, we're shooting emails back and forth. He's a modern kind of guy that way. But he will not meet with me. He said, I'll talk to you on the phone, but I will not meet with you. And I don't want my kids knowing about this. And initially, he didn't want his name used. I said, fine, I'll change your name. And then halfway through, and this is the reason I did the book, I'll get personal here. My mom got cancer halfway through my search. And she was bad shape, going down slow. My sister took up most of the slack. When I could, I was teaching in New York then. I would go back in summers, months, and I would spell my sister and take care of my mom. That was priority. And I was burned out on it. It was too much. I mean, this was not a happy project, as you can imagine. So I gave up on the story, and Mr. Rossblock, and I never pushed him on his name. I just wasn't, whatever, I respected what people wanted. And at one point, this is why, this ties into what I just said, he said, I want you to use my name. I says, why, Mr. Rossblock? He said, the kids today have to know what war is really like. And I want them, and I want my name on there. So I said, okay. And that's the reason really why I got back into the book. I realized my mom passed away in 2009. There's a message from these guys to the generation today. I found out my father suffered at least 2 major blast concussions. He had traumatic brain injury. You don't heal from TBI. They're called axons. They actually snap. And a doctor told me, Dr. Smith at Penn, it's like silly putty. If you take silly putty and you pull it slowly, it stretches. That's your axons. Like if I pick the book and whack my head, my axons just went bling. But if a concussion, you take silly putty and pull it hard, bam, it snaps. And they never grow back together. Alzheimer's is a common symptom. Raging fits like my father had, real common symptom. We never knew. And so that's really one of the main discoveries of this book. There are others. So my quest began, and this is Captain Hagler, my father's captain. I found him in Southern California. He's just died last year. He was 92 when he died. And Captain Hagler was an amazing man. He collected war things. On the right is a U.S. Sherman tank that was in his backyard. This is a Japanese tank. You can kind of see why the Japanese lost. I mean, it's like a Toyota versus a Hummer. Now those were gone by the time I showed up. This is an older picture, but he had hundreds and hundreds of items. This is the helmet of Lieutenant James Broussard, killed on June 12, 1945. Hagler was standing next to him. Japanese sniper, bullet went through the helmet. He kept the helmet. This is the sniper who killed Mr. Broussard. Pretty intense stuff. What was fascinating to me most, though, was he had, it's kind of run off the screen. Sorry about that, guys. He had letters to the families. He wrote to the families for years. And these letters, there's others in the book that are amazing. This is Mr. Mulligan's grandfather. What happened to my boy? They tell me my body, I don't know much, MUTCH. Clearly, working class guy. Please help me find my boy. He was the legal guardian for Mr. Mulligan. Plaintive letters through the years. And by then, Captain Hagler was a civilian. He had no answers. And the government, you know what? They didn't care. They wrote it off as unrecoverable. His remains probably were taken to the Punch Bowl as an unknown in the year after Okinawa battle. And there's 300 unknowns in the Punch Bowl Cemetery. And I'm working with the Hickam Air Force people, the recovery unit. And I'm hoping the book that relatives come out, if we can get DNA, we can put a name on his grave. The book isn't over. I'm still trying to get that done. For Mr. Owens, for my dad, I want to put a name on Mr. Mulligan's grave. So I'm hoping the relatives come forward through this. Because now the government does care. They really are trying to identify him. But back then, they weren't. Move on. Like my mother always say, get over the war. But she didn't know my dad had brain injury. So then I found these guys. This is Fenton Grainert. He, happy kid. Battle of Okinawa, Sugarloaf Hill on Okinawa. 13 times they tried to go up this little hill. The Japanese did a reverse slope defense. They had caves dug in there. The Marines hit it, and then in the Shuri Heights they had artillery, and they were able to just blast the Marines. 3,000 on each side died at this hill. This is where my dad had blast concussion first time. All these guys were taken out except for Hank Markovich, who had actual bleeding wounds. The rest of these guys all were blast concussion injuries. The shells were. Fenton Grainert said a shell blew up right in front of his hole, blew him out of his hole. He says, I went crazy. I couldn't. I didn't know where I was. So my dad's taken out. Frank Palmisani, and I talked to all these guys. So there's Fenton Grainert today. Fenton Grainert was shot in the face by a sniper the last 2 days of the operation, he was left for dead. They figured he wasn't going to make it. And he just died last year as well. And he's a big character in the book. Then there's Mr. LePant, from the war and now. And Mr. LePant was an interesting story. The night I told you my father was being attacked when he got shot and almost killed, or the mortar round went off behind him and he stacked the bodies around him. LePant was right near my dad that night. And they went on to the little town of Sume. All 500 Japanese soldiers basically were executed or killed in explosions. The ones that were alive in the morning were executed. They took no prisoners on Guam. It's one of the little-known facts about World War II. There was a policy. Japanese didn't surrender, but also there was a policy, don't take prisoners. And he found this picture of a platoon or a squad, I don't know, a company, it's 140 guys, Japanese company. And so his stepson and I, not stepson, I'm sorry, his son-in-law and I put this in a scanner, and we went in and looked at the faces. So for the first time, Mr. LePant actually saw the faces, and he's just looking, and he's a born-again Christian, Mr. LePant, and he has no animosity towards the Japanese whatsoever. And I'll just read one thing that he told me. As he's looking at these pictures, he says, "They're all dead. None of them made it," LePant said, shaking his head. "They've got to have had a lot of guts. I have no ill feeling to this day. It'd have been nice to talk to a Japanese soldier who was in it, to see what their feelings were, if it was just a job or if it was actually hate. I can't say that in the war I had the feeling of hate. I mean, I just wasn't brought up that way. They were doing what their officers told them to do, and I was doing what my officers told me to do." And my father said essentially the same thing when he was selling Japanese tools in the 70s in his company. Nachi, they would put the name on in ink. We would buff the name off because there was anti-Japanese hatred. And I said, so the Japanese sales reps were coming one day. I said, "Dad, isn't this kind of weird?" He says, "Nah, same thing." He said, "It wasn't personal, you know." And the Japanese guys came and it was like, fine. I'm not saying my dad was the most liberal guy on earth, but it wasn't personal for him. But look at these faces. Some are mean, some are, but like that guy in the background, does he really want to be there? It's like, man, give me home to Tokyo, you know? So that was, then there was Frank Palmisani, who signed my dad's flag. And Mr. Palmisani was a flamethrower man. And this is what happened this is from Frank Hagler's collection. Frank probably burned this body. There weren't that many. The body burns at 1,200 degrees for 24 hours. It's nasty stuff. Basically, it's an ash in the shape of a human. So Palmisani told me, this is just before he died, there was a prisoner taken, a Japanese lieutenant, and the guy went to Stanford University in California. He says he spoke better English than I did. So they brought him in for questioning to the company captain, and the captain said, "Take him down to the stockade. You know, they'll take care of it." There was no stockade. So Palmisani takes him outside. The first thing he asked me for was a Lucky Strike cigarette. The only cigarettes we got was from the Seabees in the Navy. Wing cigarettes, 4 in a pack. I said, "I got wings." "You want a wing?" I pulled out the wings. There was 2 cigarettes in it. I was going to give him one. He said, "No, I want a Lucky Strike." So I said, "You want a Lucky Strike? Huh? I'm going to give you one." And I stuck the bayonet right in his neck. Palmisani paused. I killed him, rolled him over in the hole. That was the end of him. "You didn't get in trouble?" "No, he was going to get it anyway, whether I did it or somebody else." "What were you going to do with him?" "Was it hard to do?" I asked. "No," he replied fast. "Nuh-uh. I never liked any of them alive." "How do you feel about Japanese people today?" "Same way." "You didn't take any prisoners on Guam?" "None. None at all." So that's 2 disparate views on the war. Then there's, oh my gosh, this is Joe Lanciotti. Joe did a self-published book called The Timid Marine about how he cracked up in the Battle of Okinawa at Sugarloaf Hill, where my dad and all those guys got blast concussion. He stood up, drug his rifle, and walked away. So they tagged you. It was called Yellow. They put him in the hospital, and they called him a chicken. And he said he told me, he said, I knew this was stupid. I said I knew we'd be doing business with Japan in the future. This is ridiculous. So, but what was incredible about Joe is he wrote about the forbidden subject which is cracking up. 26,000 guys cracked up in Okinawa. No one admits it. He was brave enough near the end of his life. I'm packing it in. He says, kids have to know today. No, none of these guys call it the good war. None of them used that term. So he said, frequently there were men with their toes on the trigger of their rifles, the rifle muzzles in their mouths, and their heads blown open. They had tired of war. These are Japanese who committed suicide. When I went to Okinawa, this was in the museum there, a depiction of a skeleton that was found. And then the killer one is, again, he didn't know this when he told me this. I interviewed him, and he said he was nicknamed in the company was the poet. He carried a book of poetry with him. I think it was a Norton anthology, actually. And he recalled Emily Dickinson's poem about waiting for death. He repeated it over and over. He thought this: where I died and my friends died and the enemy died, there'd be a parking lot for a shopping mall. So I go to Okinawa, and guess what is on Sugarloaf Hill today? I go to Okinawa. And I went for a number of reasons. I wanted to meet some of the people connected to my father's items from the chest and give them back to the families if I could. I wanted to see where the tomb was and just feel I call it the Island of Ghosts. It's a very creepy place to go to. It's beautiful. My dad said over and over, he said, well, if there wasn't a war going on, it was gorgeous. White sand beaches. I mean, the snorkeling must be awesome. I didn't have time or inclination to do that at that point. So I go there, and I had a lot of descriptions of where the tomb was. It was easy to find, actually. This is Jim Lockridge, who is an amazing story in the book. I can't even begin to tell some of his stories. He talked about pulling the gold teeth out of the cadavers, the Japanese cadavers. And he had a lot of hatred towards the Japanese. And I visited him twice, and I spent hours with him. And the last time I saw him, he was totally in like, he said it was a chicken shit thing to do. I shouldn't have done it. He died. His stepdaughter called me and said, your visit came at a very important time. He hadn't been talking about the war. He said you got a lot of poison out of his system. But Jim was amazing. I really liked Jim. Even he did horrible things, but he was reflective on them, which a lot of guys weren't. Like Mr. Palmasani wasn't. And he told me where the tomb was. He said there was these radio towers, and I showed him this picture, military picture. That's the hill. The tomb is right there. I lined these up. It's like a thumbprint. When I went there, the roads were all the same, and every guy. So I drew. This is the map from Captain Hagler. This is the route they went that morning. They went up the backside of the hill. So I went up there, and there it was. Like, there's the tomb. Now, this is a rebuilt tomb. There was a complex of tomb. There's a piece of jungle next to it. That's where it blew up. Mulligan was standing about where I was standing and threw the grenade, within 20 feet. Then I went to Hill 69, the last place. This is where Fenton Grainert was shot in the face and almost killed. And now it was, the pictures from the war, they're all black and burned hills. It's all jungle. It's grown back in. So I climb up this mountain, and I get to the top, and there's a cave. And I went into it. And it was this long, it was the main cave complex, defense complex for the Japanese soldiers. In the wall, I'm surmising this is a piece of a Japanese grenade. It's different than the American grenades, blown into the rock. The Japanese would sometimes kill themselves when the Americans were closing in. I found a rotting sole of a Japanese soldier's shoe in there. These are American grenade fragments. And Ed Hoffman was one of the 4 guys who made the top of the hill. Very likely Ed Hoffman threw this grenade. I put everything back, of course, when I was done. I brought it out, took pictures, put it back. This is where the man's passport, this is where his house had stood. This is his son. I found him, Mr. Zayasu, Seijin Zayasu. And this is, okay, you're allowed one comic moment in all of this craziness. So there's a vacant lot. I had an interpreter with me. I don't speak Japanese. Across the street is, on the mailbox, Zayasu. Let's go knock. I knock. Door opens. Elderly man answers. I said, are you related to Seichi Zayasu? Yeah, he was my uncle. I said, I think my father killed him. I'm like, gulp. And he's like, what? No. He died in 1952. What? Come in. So Okinawans are very hospitable. We had tea and we talked. Turns out he died in a construction accident in 1952. my dad, the house is the only house standing in the little town of Okuma. My dad went in and ripped it off. They had fled to the mountains to hide. He went and just took it. So it was like, so I gave him back the wallet, the passport, and I pull out this baby picture, and he says, "That's me." There's no pictures of me a baby. So I was like, oh my God. I said, so he was like so ecstatic to see his baby picture. And I said, I apologize for my father. I'm sure if my father were alive, he would apologize too. And he would. I know my father would have. My father wasn't the guy he was when he was younger. And he says, no, we didn't care. He says, we're the only family that no one got killed in. We didn't care if anything was gone. We were just all alive. That's all we cared about. So that was pretty intense. This is a picture that was the Marines gave them a booklet about landing, about Okinawans. They're very gentle people. They had no guns or knives. When Commodore Perry went to Japan, he blasted his way into Tokyo Harbor. He just landed in Okinawa. They had no defense. They're totally a peaceful people. And of course, Japan during the Meiji Restoration took over Okinawa, but the Okinawans have always been considered second-class citizens by the Japanese. But they're very humble and very peaceful. And that's what they said. You're not going to have, these people are not mean people. So I met some of the civilians when I was there. And this is Mrs. Onishi. Her story is amazing. I want to get to Q&A, but I just quick stories. 150,000 civilians died in the Battle of Okinawa. 16 of her family members fled the city of Naha as the Marines, my father's unit, was coming towards Naha. They fled to the south. 2 weeks later, only 3 of them were left alive. 13 of them died. And it wasn't the guys in my dad's company shooting them. My dad's guys, none of these, except there's one jerk. I'm not even going to talk about it in the book. There's one, everybody hates the guy, and I hate him too. That's all I'll say. They didn't want to kill civilians. It was the naval shells and the aerial bombs that killed most. 100,000 died in the last 2.5 weeks of battle. And so she told me her story. She's got scars at her legs. She showed me. So I got her story. This is the guy. His name is in the training manual, Sanamasa. And we couldn't find his family. I tried, couldn't do it. But in the search for Sanamasa's family, I met Mr. Yamada, Yoshikuni Yamada, who was, there's very few Japanese soldiers alive. 150,000 soldiers died. 7,000 were alive off the island. So you don't find many of these guys. And this is him today. And I met him at the southern part of the island, and I don't recreate things. He had just laid in the ground and shown where he was going to commit, they call it kirikomi. We call it banzai attack. The Japanese call it kirikomi, to go in cutting. It's basically suicidal combat. He had a grenade in one hand, or actually in two hands, one to kill an American and one to kill himself. And he was laying there, and I went, oh my God, I got my camera, and he sat up. And I couldn't say, hey, could you do that again? I don't do that. So he showed me where he was going to commit to kirikomi, and then we went to a special place. He says, I want to show you Tatsuo's place. So we go to another part. A week before that had happened, we went to a big coral rock mountain, and there was this incredible trail in the jungle. I thought, this is like a tourist trail. We're hiking down this trail, and it dead ends. And I find out it's where Tatsuo died, his best friend. Since 1954, he's been going twice a week to the site of Tatsuo's grave, or death spot. It's not a grave, it's a death spot, and praying. And I won't get into it. You get into with the Okinawans because of the ancestry worship. It gets very otherworldly. There's a lot going on. So I had this translated after. This is exact. I tape recorded it. This is what he uttered as we're standing there. So he's speaking to Tatsuo. Tatsuo, there's an American here today who says his father fought in the Okinawa War, and he was a Marine. This man was a victim of post-traumatic stress and struggled from it. His son is here in Okinawa to find out some different things, and I'm trying to share my experiences with him, and that is it. He came all the way over here, and we will talk a while and pray that you rest in peace. Tatsuo, please rest in peace. So then he wanted to get out of there, and it was very intense. Everything about meeting the Okinawans was totally intense. And then I went to the official War Dead Monument that has 250,000 names on it. And of course, there's Herman Walter Mulligan. I found him. Didn't mean anything. Monuments. My dad hated monuments. He hated it. He hated military parades. He's like, and I, for a different reason, I quote William Manchester, the writer who did several books on war, and I'm forgetting now the title of his most famous war book. But he did a book about, he went back and looked at the battle sites. And he said he hates monuments because they're too beautiful. He was a Marine in the 6th Marine Division. He fought in Okinawa. And he said, you know, I stood there, I felt empty. So I kept going back to the tomb. I was on Okinawa for 2 weeks. And almost every night, sometimes twice a day, I'd walk to the tomb, about 2 kilometers from my hotel. And there was a place behind the tomb where these other tombs were. It was spooky up there. And I put notes, both in kanji characters and English, asking for, you know, who owns this tomb, what's here. There's still bullet marks. And every night I came home, there was it's not really a red light district. They're called, I don't know what they call them. You spend 4,000 yen for 60 minutes of talking to a pretty young woman. And there's all these clubs. There's these barkers out front with their hair slicked back. And any single guy going through there gets, you know, hawked in. They never, they looked away when I came. They were like this. And it was freaky because it was like, every time I had death in my eyes. It was like, they knew that I was not interested in this. That's how intense that tomb visit was every evening. So I did my own little ceremony for Mr. Mulligan at the tomb. I'm not even going to try to explain what happened. That's one thing, that's one story that's less left for the book. It's something really magical and wild happened. And I did my own little ceremony, and that's my journey. Thank you for coming out on a stark and stormy night.